Hello, everybody. My name is Alex Wiseman. We're here to talk about Preschool in Three Cultures Revisited, this book right here. And we're doing this for CIE 401 Globalization and Contextualization. Today, we're going to talk specifically about some of the background for the book, as well as the introductory chapter and then the chapter on China. Although will be framing it with a theoretical or conceptual framework and thinking through how globalization and contextualization can be either seen in what happens in the chapters we're reading for today, or ways that there is evidence provided that either contradicts or somehow provides an alternative perspective on globalization and contextualization from that we've previously discussed in class. So, without any further ado, let's remind ourselves where we started. Right? We started by thinking about this global model versus national challenge. We did this a little bit in class last week. And we were looking at this quote from Jürgen Schriever from 2000, where he said, comparative and international education research has thrown into relief the conspicuous contrast between A, the global spread of transnationally standardized educational models, and B, the persistence of varying sociocultural interrelationship networks. So on the one hand, we have this global spread of models, this globalization. On the other hand, we have this persistence of varying sociocultural interrelationship networks, which is the contextualized interaction that happens within schools and in society in general. So we've got the globalization contextualization idea that they are both contrasting and complementary, that they tend to describe different, dare I say opposite, I think opposite might be too much, but differently headed phenomena, and yet they occur in a way that they seem to be inseparable, these two phenomena. We talked about the idea of universalized scripts as one way to understand what was going on, and said that these are shared expectations and values regarding what education is and how it should be structured or studied, which is going to be important for us when we're considering preschool in three cultures, because one of the goals of the authors of this and the researchers who did this study was to see what shared expectations regarding education and how it is structured, or studied might be a stretch, but how it is structured, developed or changed or existed. We also talked about constructs and how universalized scripts construct education in a rationalized way, right? And that's going to be important, this idea of a rationalized way. Not a correct way, not a right way, not even a best way, but a rationalized way that enhances capacity, diversity, and efficiency within the boundaries of shared expectations. So the idea that universalized scripts had a way for constructing education or rationalizing education within boundaries created by shared expectations. And we looked at the way that mass schooling sort of either represented this phenomenon or showed us a way to think about this phenomenon. One is that mass schooling's institutional components are that it is large scale and organizationally complex. And I don't want to go over each of these in this section right now because we reviewed them last week. But let me just briefly say, large scale and organizationally complex, it is a large bureaucratic organization. It has been institutionalized in many places, dare I say worldwide, which makes it quite a complex and bureaucratic organization. There are public models of schooling, meaning that it is mass, right? It's universal. There are few people who are not expected or invited or encouraged or forced to attend school, especially government-sponsored school. It is professionally staffed. Even when there is not formal training for teachers, there is a distinction between the role and the profession of teachers, or the expectations for teachers' behavior and activity, that is unique and different from other jobs, as well as from the students themselves. And then this idea of low differentiation between schools simply means that organizationally, the schools have a more level playing field than they had in the past, especially when we think about the history of elite formal schooling and then nothing else. So, in the 21st century, these are some institutional components of mass education or mass schooling. And we talked about some questions that institutionalists ask, especially when they're considering education. One is, why do things look so similar? And they use the word homogeneous here, although we have some discussion we can have about that. Why are schools more homogeneous across countries than would be predicted by the actual variability of national societies and cultures? In other words, isn't it odd that education, especially mass education or formal education in systems worldwide, look, feel, act, contain such similar elements when the variability of national societies and cultures is actually quite large? I mean, the difference between the community that I'm sitting in right now in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and one in, let's say, Paarl, South Africa, the actual society and culture has some significant differences, let's just say, right? So why is education not more different and not more uniquely crafted to fit particular communities? That's one question. Another question, what leads national education systems to both expand and standardize around the world at an increasing rate? Or some might say, now that it has expanded very widely worldwide, that the rate is decreasing, not because of the phenomenon losing steam, but because there are fewer and fewer places to expand into. So why do national education systems expand and standardize? And then finally, is there a world society or a world culture that contextualizes and impacts education in specific nations, communities, and schools? Is there some way that there is a shared set of expectations, that there is a shared social or cultural norm for schools? These are all interesting questions, and they are just that, questions. What is the evidence? What do we see that would suggest either that these questions are answered in the affirmative or the negative? We could also take a look at a quote from a reading that we looked at last week from Ramirez and Bolai. This reading was from their article, The Political Construction of Mass Schooling or Mass Education, I can't remember the exact title, from 1986-87. And they said that though cultural differences among national societies persist, it is increasingly taken for granted that all peoples must be organized into national units, that states must control those units, that economic development and social justice are attainable goals reflecting the highest purposes of humanity, that the state must play a central role in society if those purposes are to be realized, and that an expanded state educational system is essential to individual and national progress. And we did a couple of things. One is we said, hey, this came out in the late 1980s. Is this still valid now, or has the approach changed? Secondly, we looked at what are the distinctions between the nation and the state. And we said that why is that important? Why is it important that we distinguish between national units and the state? We also said that it was important to recognize that they started out by saying that cultural differences persist, that there is no homogenization that occurs, that standardization, whilst a phenomenon that is happening, does not mean that everything becomes the same. That is really important to consider, right? What is important about it is that they're suggesting that mass education developed, particularly in this article that we're referring to in Europe, as a way to expand or develop individuals and nations, right? A way to establish progress. Now the question is, as we shift from our theoretical frameworks that we were looking at earlier in this course into our reading of Preschool in 3 Cultures over the next 3 weeks, we have to ask, what applies to Preschool in 3 Cultures, especially revisited? I have to remember to say the word revisited because this is the more recent one. Does this apply? Are we talking about nations and states? Are we talking about persistent cultural differences? Are we talking about individual and national progress? So let's start with some basic questions when thinking about Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited. First one, just a big one. Is there a common or a shared pedagogy for early childhood education across countries? And in the case of Preschool in Three Cultures, we're talking about China, Japan, and the United States. So is there a common or a shared pedagogy, that's a way of teaching, for early childhood education across countries? Now, key element to this, common pedagogy, early childhood education, cross-national, right? Does this exist? Now, I'm going to just guess that most initial responses will be typically no. Other than some structural things like children gathering together, a teacher being present, and learning occurring in some form, most people are going to immediately react that there are not cultures of schooling that are shared across countries. Specifically not for early childhood education, which was one of the less institutionalized forms of education compared to primary, secondary, or tertiary. And certainly not a common pedagogy, because pedagogy probably isn't even a term that you could use in all countries to describe early childhood education. There's not always a teaching component. But what I want to suggest is that the answer is more complex than a simple yes or no. Right? For example, what are other, perhaps more specific or differently perceived questions that need to be asked as well? So how do we take this question, this big question, and our initial sort of gut reaction and move it a little farther? Well, let's start with these basic questions as we consider Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited. 1 or 2, do schools reflect the culture of the societies they serve? That's going to be important. So when we look today, for example, at the chapter on China, do the Chinese preschools reflect the culture of the Chinese society that they serve? Next, do schools contradict the culture of the societies they serve? In any way, does the preschool or the preschools that we're looking at in China, in Preschool and Three Cultures Revisited, contradict the culture of the Chinese society that they're located in? Now, I say here, these are grounding questions for us that can help address the globalization and contextualization issues we're interested in, because they start us off by saying, 1, do we see the schools and the culture actually working together? And 2, do we see the schools and the culture in the local society resisting one another? In other words, is it a divergence or is it an integration? Is it resistance or is it some sort of cooperation? Right? We need to think about how we're looking at schools and society and culture for each of the 3 societies or nations that we're going to be looking at: Japan, China, and the United States. So let's keep that in mind. Let me see if I can briefly go over the author's background in the minute that I have left before I pause for the next section. We have 3 authors. We have Joseph Tobin, Yesue, and Mayumi Karasawa. Joe Tobin, at the time of publication, was the Nadine Bathis Basha Professor of Early Childhood Education at Arizona State University. He's currently a Professor Emeritus. If you go to his website there are no spaces in that. You can see more information on him. Yesue, I'm totally mispronouncing his name, so I apologize for that. At the time of publication, he was Associate Professor in the Department of Counseling, Educational Psychology, and Research at the University of Memphis. He's currently in the same position. And Mayumi Karasawa, at the time of publication, was a Professor of Comparative Psychology at Tokyo Women's Christian University. She's also currently in that same position, and you can find more information on her there. So let me leave you with this thought before I come back in the next screencast. What is it about each of these authors' backgrounds, Joe Tobin, Yesue, and Mayumi Karasawa, that overlaps? Why do they have a shared interest, and where are they headed? Talk to you in a few minutes in the next one.